Hello, I'm Shannon Tiezi from the Diplomat, and I'm here today at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I'm happy to have a chance to sit down with Dr. Milan Vaishnav. He is an associate at the South Asia program here at the Carnegie Endowment, and he's going to be talking with us about U.S. President Barack Obama's recent visit to India. Dr. Vaishnav, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, this trip caught people a little bit off guard back when it was announced. Modi and Obama just met when Modi traveled to the U.S. back in September. A U.S. president has never visited India twice during his term. This was Obama's second trip. And a U.S. president has never been the chief guest at India's Republic Day parade. So a lot of new stuff going on. How important was this visit for U.S.-India relations?
I think it was pretty significant. I mean, obviously, the symbolism was quite powerful to have a U.S. president be the chief guest at Republic Day for the first time ever, to have a president take the time out to visit a country twice during his tenure. I mean, you can imagine with only 2 years left, the president hasn't been to a lot of places, so the idea that he would go back to India, I think, caught many people by surprise. And I think it's emblematic of both sides understanding that they have a real convergence of interests looking forward, both in terms of the trajectory of their economies, as well as how they see the world. And I think what is unusual about this particular instance is that that India has been so open about embracing the United States. Historically, India and the U.S., although there have been periods of bonhomie and getting together, it's always been somewhat kept under wraps. So this was definitely a new breakthrough.
So a lot of people are talking about this is the start of a new era in U.S.-India relations. Do you think we're actually going to see that sort of sea change in the way the two countries approach each other? Or is this just a nice gesture, but maybe not so much with long-term significance?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the substance. I mean, you know, the symbolism is great. It sends messages to the bureaucracies. It sends messages to the general public about the intentions and directions the two countries would like to take. But at the end of the day, the U.S. and India have a very, very long to-do list. And as we've seen in recent years, an inability to really make progress on that to-do list can really start to create tensions between the two countries.
And of course, Obama ended up cutting this trip short because he wanted to visit Saudi Arabia, pay his respects for the deceased King Abdullah. How did that resonate in India? Was there any sense that India was being pushed down on the priority list yet again?
You know, it made a big splash when the news broke that the president was going to cut his trip short and forsake a visit to the Taj Mahal, which was obviously going to be an incredible photo opportunity. Those feelings really evaporated as soon as the president touched the ground in New Delhi. I mean, this was the closest thing you could possibly get to a royal visit. I mean, the amount of attention, the amount of excitement there was, you saw many of the images of not just the prime minister and his cabinet, but of just, ordinary Indians who had lined the streets for Republic Day. So I actually think nobody will even remember the fact that he didn't go to Agra on the third day.
So what did you make of the symbolism of Obama sitting at Modi's side while we have a parade of Indian military equipment going by?
Well, it was pretty interesting because it tells you something about the past and potentially the future. I mean, as Obama was sitting there as the chief guest on Republic Day, a lot of the military hardware he saw rolling down the streets of New Delhi were Russian-made, Soviet-made pieces of equipment. Obviously, the United States would like to change that and see, in future Republic Days, a greater number of American aircraft, American artillery and equipment come down the streets. That was clearly one major outcome of this summit, was trying to forge a path towards greater bilateral defense cooperation. And I think that was really, if I had to pick one issue where there was a clear victory, it would be this one.
Do you think we're going to see more of a convergence on the strategic level between the U.S. and India in terms of order setting in the Asia-Pacific region, in terms of dealing with joint security issues?
I think so. I mean, I think that really was the context to this trip. I mean, I think a lot of us have been asking, why would the Prime Minister reach out to the President in this way? I mean, after all, let's not forget this was somebody who was denied entry into the United States for more than a decade. because of the events of 2002. And I think what's different about this prime minister is that he sees, to a much greater extent than his predecessors, strategic convergence vis-a-vis China and the Asia-Pacific with the United States. And so one thing I would mention is, in addition to having, the joint statement, which you always have when you have two leaders come together, there was a separate issuance of a joint statement on the Asia-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean, which talked in very blunt terms about things like commitments to human rights, something that India and the United States share but not China. They talked about commitment to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So there's really only one intended target of that message, and that was China.
Do you have a sense that China is concerned about this? Their media was downplaying it, saying it wouldn't have any impact, but is that just sort of saving face, or are they really not at all concerned about U.S. and India becoming a tighter bloc?
Oh, I think they're quite concerned. I mean, I think they were certainly watching very closely and probably did not like most of what they saw. I mean, I thought, there were some reactions which came out of Beijing to suggest that the utter defensiveness in which those statements and dismissiveness in which they were given was actually a sign that they were a little bit worried about this. And I would just point out, on the very day that the president landed in New Delhi, the chief of army staff and from Pakistan was visiting Beijing. So there was clear symbolism from that direction as well.
Right. Well, let's move on a little bit to focus on the bilateral issues between India and the U.S., one of the major ones being a potential breakthrough on nuclear cooperation. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so, in 2005, obviously, India and the U.S. decided to cooperate on civilian nuclear issues. That collaboration was never consummated because 3 years later, the Indian Parliament passed a nuclear liability bill, which put a great onus on both nuclear operators as well as suppliers in terms of liability should there be an accident. So we've not seen any U.S. investment go forward in the nuclear energy space. What the two countries seem to have signed up to is basically a set of conditions to govern the enabling environment that would allow for investment to come in. So, for instance, the government of India has agreed to raise private money as well as provide public money for an insurance pool to indemnify nuclear suppliers in the case of accident. The U.S. has conceded something to the Indians. They were very concerned about being able to have American access to tracking nuclear fuel supply. They have agreed to back down and let the IAEA handle that. I think the big sticking point, and where we still haven't seen the fine print, is what's going to happen on liability in terms of suppliers versus operators. The way in which the nuclear bill has been interpreted is that liability extends to both those who supply nuclear energy as well as those who operate nuclear reactors. The Indians have said that no, in fact, liability only rests with the operators, which would give then entry to foreign suppliers coming in. Now, this is going to be a legal call that private firms are going to have to take, and I think they don't, quite frankly, know what the Indians have agreed and what that legal opinion looks like.
Now, the Obama administration is sort of framing this as an advance on climate change. They've made that a huge plank in Obama's last few years in office. We saw a landmark agreement between the U.S. and China, and that sort of shifted a lot of pressure to India. What is India going to do? Do you think there's room for cooperation on climate change, or is this going to become a sticking point in the relationship?
Well, I think it has the potential to be a sticking point. I mean, I think India sees itself as an outlier, as an exception. It is not like China. It is far poorer than China. And furthermore, it pollutes at a much smaller rate on a per capita basis than China does. And so it feels like it should be given greater leeway. The U.S. has not quite been willing to give it that leeway. But I do think we had a couple of interesting breakthroughs here. The U.S. stepped up to the plate with the promise of financing for solar power, for new green technology, R&D in the climate space. The Indians did announce new plans to increase their reliance on renewable energy. Now, they didn't make any binding commitments, but the fact that you had two heads of state talk at this level of detail at the head of state level about this issue heading into negotiations in Paris for the upcoming climate conference, I think is a very good sign.
Well, lots to keep an eye on moving forward from climate change to defense cooperation. And thank you so much for discussing these issues with us.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiesi from The Diplomat.